Welcome, everyone. So nice to see you all. I'm sure you've all been out in your gardens the last couple of days, getting a lay of the land. I'm Judy Clem with the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory. We're so delighted to have you here today for our presentation on native plants. I just want to give you some background about the conservatory and about the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory, and then we'll turn it over to our speaker, who I know you're very interested in hearing from. In the early 1970s, the Oak Park Conservatory had fallen into disrepair. Some of you probably remember that. And it was slated for demolition, believe it or not. A group of concerned citizens successfully banded together to raise funds to save it. This informal support group inspired community leaders to form and incorporate the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory. Next year, the Friends will be celebrating 35 years. So exciting in our community. Today we offer a wide range of programs as well as volunteering, educational and recreational programs, tours and classes. And now we are venturing into virtual programming. Thank you for participating in our very first virtual event this season. Just a couple of housekeeping. Just to introduce yourselves, if you scroll your mouse to the lower part of your screen, you'll see a chat box. And we ask that you put your questions into that chat box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We're going to have everybody muted for the whole meeting. And it should be about a 1-hour presentation, and we'll break at some point in the middle so Stephanie can answer some of your questions. And thank you so much for joining. I will introduce Stephanie and then turn it over to her screen. Stephanie Walquist from West Cook Wild Ones. Stephanie is co-founder and vice president of West Cook Wild Ones, an environmental organization that advocates for the use of native plants in public and private landscapes to create and sustain biodiversity. A lifelong gardener, Stephanie has focused on native plants and animals since 2003. Her yard has close to 120 native species, and she loves to share what she learns from her garden with others. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'll turn it over to you. If you want to share your screen, we can start our presentation.
We all set? Judy, we're okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're good.
All right.
Let's do it.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you, everybody. It's nice to see you all. I'm always really excited to talk about native plants and all of the different animals they support, and just to share, how awesome and unique these plants are. A lot of times we don't really know about them until you come to a talk like this, or you get to meet other gardeners who use these plants in their landscapes. So the talk is wildly beneficial. So it's a little play on, these usually wildflowers, and that they're beneficial, and they have multiple levels of benefits. They're beautiful, they bring in life, they help solve all kinds of environmental problems, they solve landscaping challenges. So there's just so many dimensions to these plants. So I think they're really, really important. I'm very passionate about it. I am not a botanist by training, and I don't know why I can't go forward on my screen. Oh, there I am. I grew up raised by gardeners. My mom, she did some gardening, mostly edible gardening and a little garden in the front. And then my grandmother did a lot of gardening. She had grown up in the Depression, so she did composting. They had an acre of land, they had a huge garden and candy and everything. But I was never really taught anything about native plants. Nobody really knew about it. And I didn't really know about it till I moved to New Hampshire, and we happened to have a new development, and we had been a little bit resistant to having an acre of lawn. We just thought that was really not a great thing, and we didn't enjoy spending hours mowing it on the weekend. And we were surrounded by these beautiful woods and these beautiful kind of wetlands. So we stopped mowing, and things just came back. So we got really lucky because there had, it was pretty fresh, and we had these pristine areas where plants were able to come in from. And then I got a guidebook and started to learn. I started learning a lot about butterflies. And then I just grew to really appreciate how essential native plants were, how how intimately tied they are to so much in our world. And then I was also doing a lot of hiking, and I would see these like really interesting plants along the way, and I had a guidebook, and so I would get to know them, and I just felt it was like it enhanced my hike. I would just know so much more of what I was seeing, and then have a deeper appreciation for where I was, or I had more of a connection to the land. And I think that's really missing from a lot of our lives, just having like a real connection to our biological heritage, right? And then knowing what is out there. And so a walk will never be boring if you know what you're looking at and what the connections are with those plants to these other animals and their ecosystems, right? So different plants have different niches in the environment. So I just found it all fascinating. I'm an English major. I love books, but I don't know. This whole idea of like this amazing world that can be right outside our doorstep. You don't have to travel far and wide. Just have a sense of curiosity, try some different plants, and you'll be amazed at what comes back. So this is a picture of me and monarch wings at the July 4th parade. You know, we pass out things and little tongue-in-cheek, put prairie back in prairie style, right? Oak Park is known for prairie style, a la, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright, but very few prairies, mostly lawns. Why my screen is not moving forward very well. Just before we get going, I just want to set us in a bigger context, because a lot of times when we have a garden, we think of ourselves kind of in a little island. We're in a bubble, right? We don't think about how we connect to larger things. So just big picture with Illinois in our land use, 90% of Illinois is privately owned. I didn't know that. I was curious, like how much is like privately owned? So 90% of Illinois is privately owned. 75% of that is in agriculture. And then I thought, well, how much is covered in lawns? Because I know the big picture statistic that we hear about 40 million acres, you know, across the United States. But I was like, well, how much in Illinois? So it's 3 to 5%. But what that is in acres is 1,111,968 acres. To the high estimate is 1,853,280 acres. So that's a lot of land. Illinois was 60% prairie. Now it's 0.01% prairie. And so basically all of our yards working together is pretty important. And this is kind of what spurred West Cook Wild Ones, just to kind of share this information, because we all have to be working together, because like one little yard in isolation isn't really going to cut it. Like we have to do more together.
Stephanie, I have a request for you to speak a little bit louder.
Oh, sure. Okay.
If you move a little bit closer to your computer, I think that might help folks. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Great. No, it's okay. So we're gonna, I'll just talk about native plants first, because sometimes that can be a point of confusion. So I just want to clarify how we're gonna talk about native plants. But so they have evolved in a particular specific place. Okay, so they have these deep ties to the soil, to the water, to the weather, to the other organisms that surround it. Usually we talk about pre-European settlement. However, some people push back on that. Well, you know, indigenous peoples also moved plants around too. So I like to go with Doug Tallamy's definition. I'll talk about him in just a second, where he really thinks like a native plant is one that has these ecological interactions with other organisms. Okay, and Doug Tallamy, if you're not familiar with him, I really recommend him. He is the thought leader for this native plants and landscaping. People have been doing this for a long time, but Doug Tallamy has been really communicating the message just to regular people about how essential our gardens are and our native plants are. He's one of those rare people who, he's a scientist, he's a professor of ecology, but he writes books that are for lay people and just sharing the science and the data that help us have this really good, solid philosophical underpinning for what we're doing in our yards, right? So that gardens are not any longer just decoration or, you know, something to extra to do. They're actually super important for the functioning of our planet. So he thinks really big, and he thinks that using native plants in the landscape is really important. So that's Doug Tallamy, and I'll mention his books a little bit later too. And the other thing about native plants is they're not naturalized introductions. So often people will say, oh, well, I see these daisies, those are native, and they assume they're native, or James Rocket is native, and that's just because they see it. It can be very prevalent in an area, and maybe they've seen it for many years, but that doesn't mean it's native. It has naturalized. It might occupy kind of a disturbed area, or it's an area that hasn't been restored by ecologists, right? Trying to remove these non-native plants. So native plants, when we're talking about them, they're ones that have been here for a really long time, thousands of years. They have deep ecological connections, right? They're part of the food web, above the soil and below the soil. And they support many different organisms. The plants are the foundation pretty much of everything. This does not go. So we talk about, so even like in our urban areas, like we can still do a lot of ecological good. So having native plants helps to reduce our costs. It's less inputs. You don't have to spend so much on fertilizer or pesticides or do a ton of maintenance. You don't have to do a lot of irrigation. At the very beginning, when you first install native plants, you do have to support them. They're just getting their root systems online. You need to do some watering, maybe the first, few weeks or so, but after that, they're pretty much on their own. And definitely after the first year, they're good. Unless we have a significant drought and you have a rain garden, you have plants that have to have water, that would be like the one time you might have to water. They might go dormant and survive it, but if you want them to thrive and to flower and do what they're supposed to do, you might need to water them. But basically, you're not going to have to really do a lot of support for them. They're going to be fine on their own. These plants do a great job of managing stormwater. I'll talk more about that later. They sequester carbon dioxide. So what that means is they suck that carbon dioxide out of the air. The carbon goes down into the root systems. They release oxygen. That carbon stays deep under the ground. And I'll show you a picture later of what happens with that carbon. So through photosynthesis, they're sucking that carbon out and they're putting it into the ground. So they're very, very important for that. And they help build soil too. The reason why, Illinois, we have so much farmland is because it was so much prairie, and it was all those roots that brought that black prairie soil, and that is because of carbon, right? That's in the soil. And that is because of those roots. So if you look over here in my little picture here, this was showy tick trefoil, which is a legume. It's a native plant, and I love it. It's got these beautiful little pink pea blooms, and it's a host plant to different butterflies. But look at that root system that it has, and it's only just a few weeks old. So a lot of these plants, the first couple of years, they put so much energy into the roots, and you will see a picture later of like how deep those roots go. But they're super important. And then you can solve these landscaping challenges in a beautiful way through the plants themselves and through the life that they bring back. And you support biodiversity. So having the diverse life forms, all these different animals that come back, it is amazing what will return once they have native plants and you maintain your landscapes in a particular way. And all of that we're learning is very beneficial for our health. Across the global scale, the #1 kind of health risk right now that's helping to kind of create these pandemics actually is a lack of biodiversity, is a loss of biodiversity. The fact that we keep destroying natural ecosystems and we're removing kind of this barrier between humans and these other animals. We're moving into their habitat, and then so we're getting exposed to things that we wouldn't be exposed to. Okay, great. I'm gonna go pretty quickly over this. So this is just another piece of the benefit, reduced maintenance. If you look at just getting started, if you have, about an acre of turf, you're gonna put down an acre of turf. It's much less expensive to do native prairie seeding. And then over the long term, native plantings would cost 1/5 of turf because you don't have to be doing that mowing, the fertilizing, pesticides, watering. You don't have to do all of that. It's pretty much okay. There still is some maintenance, but it's not like having to take care of a lawn. And lawns, they take a lot of water. If you have to water your lawn, you're trying to do that 1 inch a week, you can be burning up about 27,000 gallons a week for an acre of lawn. And across the US, we spend about 8 billion gallons of water on a daily basis for lawns, which don't really do a lot for us. I mean, I like having a little lawn, but do we need like a whole acre of lawn? When I was in New Hampshire, I did not need an acre of lawn. My neighbors didn't need an acre of lawn. To me, it wasn't worth like losing lady slippers and trilliums and Harris's checker spots and all these other beautiful butterflies for like a dead, it was green, but it was like it was a dead living space. There wasn't anything there. Nobody was really using their lawn. So it had significant cost, I felt. On this left-hand side, this is my garden. So rose and milkweed. I have yellow coneflower. This is one of my favorite plants, American bellflower. I actually get a special little bee called the bellflower resin bee, and they're a specialist on this type of plant, and they always come around when this plant is in bloom. This is a biennial, so it'll have rosettes one year and then the next year it flowers. So these guys, they were here, they won't be there that year, and it's kind of fun to see, you know, where they're going to move around, because that's what they do, and I enjoy that. Some people don't necessarily like it, but I always kind of enjoy when I get a little surprised, you know, when plants have moved around. So this is that image I was going to show you. It's very famous. Maybe you've seen it already, but just really quickly, you'll see you get about some of the plants above ground, the part that we see, and a lot of us don't think too much about what goes below ground. But as you can see, these root systems are super, super deep. Some of these guys, like this is a little cylindrical blazing star. This is a tiny little plant, and look at that, it goes down 13, 15 feet. That's about, down here is about 15 feet. And this is bluegrass right here. This is the typical lawn grass. So with these root systems, they go down. So the carbon travels down and it stays down there. Unless you're tilling or digging up, that carbon will be down there. So that's why they're very important for carbon sequestration. Somebody did a study, it can take 0.7 to 3 metric tons of carbon per year per acre of a prairie. It can vary between how old the prairie is and the quality of the soil. The other thing which they think it's a kind of a low number, because a lot of times when they pull a core sample out, they're only pulling from the top, like the top foot or so here, right? And you see so much more to go. So just more area for carbon to store. And then on top of it, they've recently discovered that mycorrhizal fungi, they add a layer of carbon storage capacity, 70% more too. So having a good soil, keeping it intact can store a lot of carbon. So 1/3 of these roots die in the winter. And then so that organic matter stays in the ground and it gets decomposed by the soil organisms. And then fungi again help with that. And then there's these, you know, these interesting connections between fungi and plants. Fungi get the plants certain nutrients, the plants feed the fungi sugars, and the fungi also might help protect plants from soil pathogens and pests. So it's pretty interesting. Somebody even did a study and they saw it's like really amazing. There was like a fungi made like a hypha, and they made like a noose. And they actually caught these little worms that were trying to get to the roots of their plant. So it's an amazing system down there. And I think it's one, I mean, a lot of people are just starting to study it and there's a lot more to be learned. But, and this is what also helps create the channels into the soil, helps to make it possible so water penetrates, and because the organic matter is holding on to the water as well. So it's an amazing system, and it's one that we're starting to learn more about and have more respect for too. And it's one we can have in our own yards. The other benefit that I really do is for the supporting the local ecology. So these plants, they support so many different insects, and a lot of people have not very well-rounded ideas of insects, but they're really fascinating in themselves. Very few percent of insects are actually pests. Most insects, 96, 97, 98%, are actually beneficial or benign. It's just a few that kind of give the rest of them a bad name. But it's all the other ones that keep those pests in check. But unfortunately, we tend to just draw a broad brush and just want to kill off every insect, and that's just shooting ourselves in the feet, basically. So it's really important. So like something like the two-spotted ladybug here, this is actually, there's a group of scientists, they were out of Cornell. They started the Lost Ladybug Project, mostly looking for the nine-spotted ladybug. But also this was considered one of them, and when I had reported it, they were pretty excited that it was found. And I have good populations of them. They'll overwinter in our landscapes. So if you do thoughtful, cleanup, you can be harboring these. And then these need to have things to eat, usually soft-bodied insects. So native plants usually have something going on for them to eat. So you can have, good supply. And then when you get aphids, you have your beneficial insects ready to go. They're right in the garden. You don't have to go buy some. They're right there. This guy here on the right is a red-headed woodpecker, and they're actually in severe decline. They're on the vulnerable to extinction list. And I've had these in my yard chasing grasshoppers. So we decide we want to kill off grasshoppers, or we use Grub-X, and we're doing things that are killing off the larvae of grasshoppers. We are starving birds like the red-headed woodpecker. They need those insects. I don't know. I would rather have a red-headed woodpecker around and have some plants get eaten by grasshoppers if it means that I can keep these guys going. Like I just find that almost like a responsibility as well. We humans have had such a detrimental impact on the environment and on our landscapes that this is a small thing we can do to help give as many creatures as much of a chance as possible. On the left hand, this is the bellflower resin bee that I told you about, little specialist. So we have hundreds of native species of bees, and we have several species of bumblebees. So one of my kind of newer passions are native bees. They're just fun. I'm always finding some kind of a different type of bee in my garden. And a lot of them have what's called specialist relationships, where the larvae of that bee have to have pollen of certain plants. So this specialist here, her babies have to have the pollen of this plant. There are some bees that have to have the pollen of goldenrod or asters. And I just recently learned that I might have a specialist of Virginia waterleaf flowers. And I think I have a picture of those later. So I thought that's, like, to me, super cool, right? Not every garden can say it, having all of these specialists, like these animals that have to have this pollen, because if they don't, they will die. Because that's what they evolved on. They evolved on that type of pollen, and they come back. And this little cutie is the golden crown kinglet. They always come through my yard looking for insects. A lot of these little warblers, they have to eat insects or insectivores, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And where are they gonna find that? Mostly on native plants. This pretty much just kind of goes over what I was just talking about. So native plants are part of the food web. The big reason is they've co-evolved with native birds, bees, and butterflies. We learned from Doug Tallamy that he focuses a lot on caterpillars, and with many of the insects too that eat plants. They're called herbivorous insects. They have special capabilities of overcoming the poisons that plants have, right? Plants have very strong chemical defenses, and the species that can eat those plants, their bodies know how to deal with that poison. They can sequester it, they can metabolize it, they can use it against their own predators. That's why native plants have that special connection. So if you take, for instance, the monarch caterpillar, their caterpillars can only eat milkweed. If you take that caterpillar and you put it on a lilac leaf, it's not going to be able to eat that. It will starve and die, or it'll get very sick. So that story repeats itself throughout most of our butterflies and our moths, right? Those are all the Lepidoptera order. So that's why they're so important. And then there's different insects that eat things, and they like to have certain plants, or they eat certain types of plants. Some will eat, tree leaves. Some will prefer, plant leaves. So that's why native plants have that tight connection with a lot of these other animals. So for instance, an oak tree, Tallamy would call these a keystone species, or such a foundation to the ecosystem, because they support so many insects. So they can support across the US about 500 species of caterpillars, whereas ginkgo can do one, but there's other native trees that support lower numbers, is it catalpa, or no, tulip tree might support 20, right? So if you have a choice between a catalpa tree or an oak tree, it might be better to do oak tree, unless everybody's planting oak trees and you want to have some diversity, right? You have some different trees. These provide the best nectar source and food for caterpillars, and the best nectar for our butterflies. People are even studying kind of the nutritional components of nectar. And again, there's this tight connection between how much amino acids and sugar and carbohydrates are in the nectar, and how it's synced up with their needs at a particular time. Most of them are pretty vigorous, they're hardy, they're adapted to heat, flood, and drought. Not everybody, some of them are a little bit more delicate than others, they're a little bit harder to get and to grow, but I think in general, once you get the right plant in the right spot, pretty much worry-free. And again, they're supporting the biodiversity, offering us lots of ecosystem services like pest control, pollination, um, helping to develop the soil, all kinds of things. This is the monarch that I mentioned earlier. If you don't have a purple coneflower, I highly recommend it. It's a really great nectar source, long blooming, will go part sun, full sun. And the goldfinches and other birds will eat the seeds in the fall. That's the other part of these plants. They have like multi-season benefits. They look great in the winter. They host silvery checker spots, which I haven't seen here, but I would love to see. Maybe someday they might come back. These are just some interesting bees. This is I think this is like a common bumblebee on a Monarda, fistulosa, wild bee balm. This is actually considered a superfood. So some of these plants are superfoods for bumblebees. They give them these important amino acids. And also this one is an immune system builder. So it's really, really important for bumblebees. This one down here is a little bee in the Osmia genus. She collects pollen on her little underbasket. Right here, she's in a prairie sundrop. And then this one is a leafcutter bee, Megachile, and they have usually their scopae, what collects their pollen down here on the bottom. And again, these are specialists. I can't remember what they specialize on, but they do. And then here's what we have is a little syrphid fly. And these guys kind of do a dual role. They're really interesting. They're little tiny pollinators, and there's different types of, they're also called hoverflies, syrphid flies. So there's different sizes, and then their larvae often eat aphids, or depending on the species, they might be in the soil helping to control pests in the soil, because there's a whole system down in the soil too. This one is really cool. So we see a lot of the non-native praying mantises. This is actually a native one. This is something I just learned about a couple of years ago, just because I had this gray praying mantis. Like, what is this? And this is the stuff I learned. I go look it up. So it's a Caroline praying mantis. And so they're usually this beautiful gray. They're smaller than the other ones. And sometimes the green, the Chinese praying mantises can get really like incredibly large, aggressive. They'll like eat so many butterflies. Some people have seen them catch hummingbirds. I don't know if they get that big here, but some people have seen them like hang around hummingbird feeders and then catch a hummingbird. But these tend not to do that. So I like to have them around. I had younger ones on cup plants. I had some aphids, and it was fascinating to watch them get in there and eat up the aphids on the cup plant. And this is a rare bumblebee. It's one that scientists who study them have been concerned about. This is the northern golden bumblebee. And I tend to get these every year, and I get them in a really good population abundance, so that there must be like a healthy nest somewhere. And this one is on Bradbury's Monarda. And so this Monarda is actually nice. It blooms a little bit earlier, usually May, early June. The other Monarda is usually July. So it's nice to be able to give these guys a good meal this time of the, early on in the year. And it's just a beautiful plant. It's low growing. Doesn't spread as profusely as the other Monardas do through the rhizomes. This guy now, this one is really interesting. Isn't he beautiful? He is a feather-legged fly. And I got a picture of him because he was so pretty. He's on goldenrod. And this is an interesting fly because they are parasitoids of stink or squash bugs. So, and as you can see, he's also a pollinator. So we tend to have this very dismissive attitude towards flies, but they're a huge group, and some of them have such interesting life history. So I just thought this was beautiful. His velvet wings and this kind of amber colored body, and then they have these bronzy eyes. And then this business on his thorax was really pretty. And I thought it was really cool to learn that they overwinter. So they lay an egg in squash or stink bugs. So they overwinter. So if you want to have, control of those things, you don't want to clean out your gardens too much, because then you'd be getting rid of these guys. And that is a blue stem goldenrod, which I really recommend. I really recommend goldenrods, especially for the fall, because they're an important source of pollen and nectar for our butterflies that either are migrating like the monarch, or for our bees who are getting ready to hibernate. So monarchs have to gain weight to hibernate once they make it down to Mexico, as well as make it through the migration. So they have to migrate and gain weight to make it through their diapause, their hibernation down in Mexico. So another benefit is feeding the birds better. So a lot of people love birds. And so the best thing to do is to really have a lot of native plants. We have lost about 30% of our birds are in decline since the 70s. About 95% of birds rear their young on caterpillars. They have to have caterpillars, and caterpillars, as we know, specialize in certain plants. So the more diversity you have of native plants, the more caterpillars you can provide. And I've just got some crazy statistics here. So little baby birds, nestlings, they need to eat about 40 times a day. And there was a man, Robert Stewart, he watched a Wilson's warbler pair in 1973. This is from Doug Tallamy again. The male brought caterpillars 241 times in one day, and the female brought something 571 times in one day. So they're just constantly flying and foraging. So if you can imagine how exhausting it is, and he watched them for about 5 days, and then they usually go a little bit longer, and then they still take care of the birds once they're fledglings, right? So, and they're bigger, they're gonna need more food. So it takes a lot of work. So it's really helpful if they have lots of native plants in the area. And then one of Doug Tallamy's students, Desiree Narango, she did a study over 3 years, and she found that like a bird, small bird like chickadees, if they're, what helps them is if a yard is at least 70% native plants. So you don't have to have everything planted native plants, but if 70% of the plants are native plants, they are supporting lots of different caterpillars and insects that they can then raise their young successfully on. So I think a lot of this decline is loss of habitat, is like the loss of habitat. And when we do get habitat and we plant things, it's usually non-native plants. So there's just not the food out there. So in effect, we're starving these poor animals. And birds love native shrubs. They love like these shrub layers. They'll like, a lot of birds like to nest in shrubs. Many of our birds are insectivores, so they won't eat seed. If you put out a bird feeder with seed, they're not gonna eat that. You're not gonna be helping them out. A lot of times those are our warblers who travel from South America. They travel up to Canada, and then they have to do it again in the fall. They go back and forth. So they traverse the continents. And they do it all on their own, and they have to avoid windows, they have to avoid cats in the yard, they have so many things they have to deal with. And then on top of it, you know, non-native plants that just don't have the insect mass that they need to be able to make it. And another interesting thing is our native berries, and Doug Tallamy again has brought the science to us, that our native berries, when birds need it, when they're migrating, usually they come up in the fall, the berries are ready, they have about 50% more fat. No, not more fat. They have 50% fat by weight per berry, right? Whereas non-native berries, like from multiflora roses, buckthorns have less than 1% fat. So these birds, again, are migrating, and they're trying to make their way. They need these berries that have high in fat to help keep up their energy, right? So that's really important. This is a beautiful low black burning warbler. It's beautiful. I won't go too much here, but this is, you probably heard, was going to the news about how we have lost 3 billion birds. And one of the things that was very disconcerting was that 15 species of common birds that we think are abundant, like, and we always get dark-eyed juncos, blackbirds, and swallows, they account for more than 2/3 of the total loss in native bird population. So our common birds, even robins, are starting to get kind of like, their numbers, they're not out of the low range, they're kind of like the low end of the moderate concern range. So I thought that was like, I was like, wow, even robins are like kind of getting in the low moderate range. So our birds are now suffering population losses in the tens of millions, similar to the decline of the passenger pigeon. And that's in the 2019 State of the Birds report that came out last year. And here's just a couple of graphics just to show. Forest birds shows their decline. Shorebirds going down again, losing lots of shoreline. And then also, you know, the things that happen to the sea and the ocean, those red tides, oil spills, things like that don't help. And then our grassland birds here, really losing. They need that tall grass prairie. You know, farmers used to let their fields kind of go fallow. Birds would use that, and it's just being lost. And you know, prairie is being used up for shopping malls, parking lots, etc. And then this is the common birds too. You can just see, like the dark-eyed junco, we still get like, it's populations are down quite a bit. And this is a little Wilson's warbler. These come through. So many birds come through, and their populations are down about 60% too. So it's a little bit of a downer, but really, you know, we can do something about that. We can plant native plants. One of the last, not one of the last benefits, another really huge important benefit is when you plant native plants, you don't add to the problem of native species. They are a huge problem. So a lot of times people will plant these native plants and they're like, oh, they're not invasive. They don't do anything. They just stay nice and tidy in my garden. But that is not how they behave when they're in an ecosystem. I've personally seen barberry bushes. I mean, I feel like barberry bushes are everywhere. But I've seen a private, you know, forest. It was at my daughter's Girl Scout camp. And I walked in there and they have these beautiful oak trees that have been there since the Revolution, right? There are no baby oak trees, and underneath the oak trees, it's all barberry bushes or it's honeysuckle. And eventually there's not going to be any oak trees. It's just going to be pure barberry. And that's a problem because wildlife can't get through it. They've studied that ticks with Lyme disease, like they have high populations there because nobody can get to them at all because the thickets are so thick. They shade out all these beautiful woodland plants. So it is really a problem. So one of the huge benefits is that when you're using native plants, you don't have to worry about kind of like making life difficult for these animals in these natural spaces that are so few and far between anyway. And then to add, you know, invasive species is just like, it's a double infliction of a wound. So a lot of our invasive plants are actually horticultural escapees. So these are things that, you know, people brought for the garden and they've made their way out into the natural landscapes. They destroy native ecosystems. They'll change the soil chemistry. They'll change how water moves through the landscape. They change the fungal connections that a lot of our native plants need to have with fungi. So it really is devastating. And so about 30% of our endangered species are endangered partly because of invasive species, and that's for both plant and animal. And then a lot of invasive species, that whole problem is second to habitat loss for endangered species. The first thing for endangered species is habitat loss, and then but when they do have a habitat, a lot of times invasive species come in, and so it really does harm them. And then just this cost, right? $120 billion in cost per year, and then that's the untold volunteer work that people are going out and they're spending their weekends cutting down, you know, removing these invasive species, and then still people are planting these same things. So they call that invasion pressure, right? It's repeated pressure. It keeps getting reintroduced into the ecosystem. So for example, a lot of you probably know about garlic mustard, right? So this was out at Thatcher Woods. I helped out one time. And this is the garlic mustard, and it's just covered the floor. We have like, well, in like Virginia waterleaf, if you know, it can be like, it's pretty robust. It's struggling because of the garlic mustard. And then under here, there were some little trilliums and some wild blue phlox, all of them like very puny because they're being overrun by a garlic mustard. And this was just one small patch here, this whole thing. And then this was taken by somebody named Michael Lynch, and I saw it on Facebook, and he had this whole series of photos of Siberian squirrel. Everybody loves Siberian squirrel, and I get it, right? It's like the first thing that will bloom kind of early on. You get these beautiful blue flowers. They look beautiful, but look what they're doing. They're like marching in and they're like covering up this trout lily. And he's got pictures of them taking out other plants too, where they're just smothering, and they probably change soil chemistry as well. And they just don't have the same ecosystem contributions that like a plant like trout lily does. Like it really super important for bumblebees in the spring. The queen bumblebee hibernates, she emerges. There's no colony to take care of her. She's got to start a colony all by herself. And trout lilies are really important for that. And then trout lilies also are important because they take up some nutrients in the spring, and then once they die, those nutrients go back into the soil. So they help with nutrient cycling. So that is like one of the prime reasons not to be using non-native plants. And they're getting better. They're trying to do better studies to make sure things are not going to be invasive. But I think just right now with climate change and everything, it's probably better to be safe, you know, and not be planting so many non-native plants.
Stephanie, why don't we pause for just a second, and we'll throw out a couple of questions if that's okay with you.
Yep, sorry.
I've got some that were just texted to me directly, and then I'll take some from the group. Stephanie will get to some of these others that I see on here if we don't answer them all right this moment. Somebody is asking, let's see, Laura, as I'm working in the yard, I have a hard time knowing what's a weed and what could be a beneficial native plant. Any tips? So I thought that might be a good one to throw out to you, Stephanie.
Right. So so I recommend, some people are using plant identification apps. That can be very helpful, at least to get you there. Also, I'm on that Garden Club Facebook group, and sometimes just posting the photo there, we can get to that pretty quickly. I didn't bring my book, but there is a book that has pictures of seedlings from some of the more commonly planted prairie plants. So that can be helpful too. Getting some guidebooks. I think I have a couple of guidebooks. Like there are all kinds that different kinds of flowers. There's even guidebooks about weeds. So I think having kind of like a foundation of having been through a book, and then when you see something, it will look familiar and you'll like be able to come back to it. But having an app right now using that artificial intelligence is pretty helpful. I know like I like to use when I need to. I usually use iNaturalist for recording observations.
Yeah.
You don't want to. I guess you could use it for that. You record it, but just make sure that like if it's a plant you're growing, you want to. There's an option to say that it's domestic, right? Because scientists use that data, and if you're saying a plant is like wild when it really isn't, that can like mess up their data, if that makes sense. But using apps that have artificial intelligence is helpful. At least it kind of can get you to, close enough. The other thing
Sure.
is just to let it grow until it flowers, and then it's a lot easier to tell as well. And then I think just over time, it's a lot of trial and error, and a lot of it is just experience. So I just do a lot of watching. If I have a lot of something that pops up, I tend to reduce the numbers until I know for sure what it is. And a lot of times, if you have a lot of something, it's probably quote unquote a weed. But you want to know what it is first before always pulling it. Because I've pulled weeds only to find out that they were important host plants too.
Sure.
So.
Very helpful, and I'll post. I'll mention iNaturalist in the chat, as well as the Garden Club of Oak Park and River Forest. If you happen to be on Facebook, those are local experts, and Stephanie and I are on there a lot, posting pictures, asking questions, and it's a great resource locally. There is this kind of broader question that I'll throw out to you that, people are looking for guidance on how to plan their gardens. And so do you hit that at the end, or, what are some brief directional tips we can give people? Somebody's asking for software, or, what are the best ways for people to go about implementing maybe a little bit of a native approach to their landscapes?
So I think the first thing you have to do, you have to really know if you have full sun, part sun, or shade. My presentation, I have some examples of those gardens. So you really need to know your sun conditions, because that's really going to dictate like what you're going to plant. And then it's just standard kind of quote unquote design masses of plants. And then you want to usually put the shorter ones at the front, and then go taller as you move backward, as you move back to the garden. So I don't think there's anything special about designing with native plants. What I think is necessary, where we tend to do this thing where we do like one single plant, and then we have like 6 feet of space around it with lots of mulch, and then we have like another single plant. And that's not as beneficial as it could be, because the plants they do better when they're together. It's better for the animals. It's better for it's shading out weeds, and kind of keeping the soil cool. So that is, to me, one of the most important things. It can be pretty expensive to do that, but it saves you a lot of time and money, and I think in the long run, because you're not having to do lots of weeding and worrying about what you planted. But I think, and you can always like access a garden designer. I think at the end of the talk, I mentioned like Prairie Moon and Prairie Nursery. They have like nice pictures of the plants. A good book, if you can get it, is Natural Midwest Gardens by Pat Hill. And she's got lots of pictures of gardens, and she's even got garden plans in there. And I really think that just, just experimenting, allow yourself to make mistakes. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, there's a saying that you have to kill a plant a few times before you really know it. But I think, try to plant masses, plant as many as you can, usually together or in a drift is ideal. It mimics kind of how things are in nature. Plant some sedges in between, and then try to make sure that you've got plants that will be blooming successfully. You want a succession of blooms. You want them to start from spring through fall. So you want things blooming in the spring, things blooming in the summer, and then in the fall too. I don't know, does that answer the question?
I think it's going to be hard to get the specific answer. There's so many resources, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to field more questions afterwards. You can always email me, and if I can't answer them, I'll reach out to Stephanie. Wild Ones, which Kayla, our membership chair, posted the Wild Ones Facebook page along with iNaturalist on the chat. A ton of great information out there. It can be overwhelming, so I think starting with a great book or guide, like Stephanie suggested, and experiment a little bit, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Learn from experience. Why don't we continue the presentation? We'll come back and ask a few more
Sure.
questions.
I'm just gonna quickly, so rain gardens, a lot of people are asking about rain gardens right now. So a lot of native plants are great for that. They really hang on to the water. They help to clear up the water. They remove pollutants and sediments. So like a plant like Kankakee mallow, which can be harder to get. I grew this from seed from Prairie Moon, but we have native hibiscuses too that I'm going to show in a second. Dwarf, dwarf iris is nice, likes full sun, water. Cardinal flower, hummingbirds love. One note about hummingbirds is 80% of their diet is insects, like small little gnats and things like that. So not just nectar, but also that. So you could have all kinds of beautiful plants for rain gardens. And this is actually, this is my garden in the back, part of it. Wild senna is a beautiful plant that I think if you have a rain garden, it's like a shrub, but it is just a herbaceous plant, which is beautiful, and bumblebees cover it. They love it in the summer. Over to the right is my friend Byron's garden. This is wild quinine, which you might plant a little bit higher up. So when you have a rain garden, you have something like a dish shape. So you have the plants that love moisture down at the bottom, and then so you plant like the wild quinine up in the top and the purple coneflowers up at the top. Liatris here is commonly planted. This here is actually in Carroll Park, and here is beautiful hibiscus, rose mallow that we have, and that just loves full sun and water. And this is another shot of Byron's garden with that Liatris. I think it's Pycnostochia. Loves rain. This is a blue lobelia. It's kind of a low-growing plant and loves, again, moist areas, part sun. So that's where you really need to know like what conditions you have. Does the soil stay moist? Because this plant would not be very happy in a hot, dry spot. And this is yellow coneflower, which can deal with kind of fluctuations in soil. Some plants are more forgiving of where they're at, and some are not. And then this is actually from Columbus Park, right across the street. So I have a wild mint, a mountain mint. There is some ironweed growing, and I believe some cut plant in the back as well. It's a hot, dry. If you have a hot, dry spot, really recommend this plant, spotted horsebalm, Monarda punctata, hoary vervain here in the back, and rose mallow. And again, we have purple coneflower, royal catchfly, which loves hot, dry spots. Hummingbirds love it. It's called catchfly because it exudes like a sticky sap and catches flies. So they think it's either like a protective mechanism or they're protocarnivorous, that they catch flies and they start to, they're digesting them in a way through some enzymes. And of course, butterfly weed, which is a low-growing milkweed. That's a host plant for our monarch butterfly right there. And lots of butterflies and bees love this plant. It's really a super important plant. Culver's root here on the left, another one of those important bumblebee plants. And Canadian milkvetch, which is kind of a low-growing. It's got this lacy leaves. So a lot of our plants too, they have like really interesting foliage. So I think it's just, it can, make your garden pretty different. You're going to have plants that aren't always going to be, like everybody else is going to have them. They're going to be unique. And this is prairie sage too, which is a nice ground cover. And these like hot, dry spots. And then of course there's prairie smoke, which blooms in the spring in like full sun and dry conditions. And this is probably late July, and there's butterfly weed. And then you see how things are really packed in there and layered, so that I'm like lots of animals are in there, finding the resources they need. You can see how bumblebees, there's probably some butterflies in there, there's probably some caterpillars. And it's densely packed. And the thing that's helpful about that is they don't have to travel very far to get their nectar or their pollen. It's all right there. The more they have to travel, they have to expend a lot of energy. A lot of times they have to figure out how to get into the flower, so that if you have a lot of a plant, they figure that plant out, they know it, and they don't have to waste time learning how to get in there and get to the nectar or the pollen. And even like, hospitals, I grabbed this picture. Hospitals understand how essential this access to nature is, that they're using native plants more around their buildings too, because there's studies that have been shown that when people are recovering and they can see a natural scene, they do much better, much faster. And then shade. I've been spending a lot of focus on shade recently because I got all my sun gardens going, and then really learned about how important our spring ephemerals are to our pollinators. So, and this is like where native gardens can really shine. So this picture here, we have wild columbine, which I think a lot of people know, and hummingbirds really love it. It tends to bloom right at the time of migration for hummingbirds, and they make their way back up here. And then we have some sedges and trillium, and I have some close-up pictures of trillium later. And so these are all plants that do really well. So these are not like fussy plants at all. This is wild blue phlox. It stays low growing. In some areas, mine kind of threads its way through. And mine, it doesn't really do a clump like that. I don't know if I just don't have the right sun for it, but mine more kind of make their way through the sedges that I have. This plant here is hepatica. It blooms really early in April. And sometimes they're white, sometimes they're pink. And then they have these really beautiful leaves. It's also called liver leaf, that basically stays almost evergreen through the winter. And these are really beautiful plants called shooting star, and super important for bumblebees in the spring, and they bloom early, usually sometime in April. And these are doing really well. Lots of people are starting to grow these, and they're not super fussy. So I started this kind of like, we got to get more spring ephemerals, start trying these, and they're doing really well. So I would recommend, if you can get shooting stars, to have them. They slowly spread. I've seen colonies in the wild where there's a nice patch of them, and they're just beautiful. And then Jacob's ladder is fairly common, but again, is a really great, beautiful plant to have in the shade and early, like beautiful blue blooms in the spring. In the front here, I have a wild larkspur. So this will start to subside, and then this starts to shoot up. So I don't really plan this. I just put plants in, and I really believe, like, once you just start including native plants, you'll learn them and you'll learn how their habits are. And a lot of times they just make it beautiful themselves because they're so interesting. So this is part of my parkway, and I just always have something happening in that little parkway I have. Wild ginger is a commonly used ground cover. It has these cool little red flowers in the spring. There's some bluebell and celandine poppy. I have a better picture of that. There's some celandine poppy, which is pretty, and that will spread. And again, there's spring ephemeral. Eventually, it'll subside. I'll have some other plants that will come in. I have some the rose mallow behind it and wild senna, and so pretty soon, those plants will be coming in for the summer. It won't be a blank spot. Be buzzing with life very quickly. This is a golden groundsel, which is a really wonderful ground cover for shade. Spreads through here, and this is basically evergreen. So if you're looking for a nice beneficial ground cover, recommend golden groundsel. Let's see, and we have bluebells, and this is a neighbor I have. He's got these beautiful mayaples as a ground cover, and this changes a lot too. I have all kinds of trilliums. He has a whole patch of trout lilies that's to die for. He's got hepatica, and he's got this rue that he says blooms for like a couple of months, and then a red bud tree. And this is the trout lily that I was talking about before. And you buy little corms, so like little bulbs, and you plant them either the fall or the early spring. They don't always bloom. A lot of times you can just get one leaf, it won't bloom, but if you have two leaves, you know it's gonna bloom. And there is something about if it drops its corm down and it hits something kind of hard, it's gonna bloom. That's gonna make it bloom. This is another hepatica, and you can see the leaves here. It's really a beautiful little plant for the woman. And this is toothwort here, and that is another early spring bloomer. And this is Dutchman's breeches, super important for our bumblebees in the spring. And then, of course, I just love to have trilliums. And again, in our urban landscapes, we can have these beautiful plants. It doesn't have to always just be hostas and daylilies. You can make it very interesting. You could just do things like sprinkle some of these around, have some sedges, have some wild ginger, and then have some shade-loving asters and goldenrod and some ferns, and you'll have like a lovely woodland garden that will be productive all season long. And this is, again, just some different plants. And I just pack things in. A lot of that's just because I want to try these plants and I get them in, and I just think it's better for them. I mean, when they're out in nature, they're packed in there. And again, it's just better for the animals that live there. It's better for the soil. The soil is covered. It's like a living mulch.
So where are the weeds? I don't see weeds, Stephanie.
I really don't have to do a lot of weeding at all because it's all covered. And then I keep leaves. I don't put leaves out into the street really. I keep all my leaves. I keep things standing over the winter. So in the spring, really, if it's pretty heavy in some spot, I might move leaves off to the side, but it pretty much takes care of itself, and then all that stuff decomposes, and it, and it improves the soil. So then to plant something, I just got to push my fingers in and then pop in my little plants, and then I'm done. And then just another benefit is for us too, like just having that access to nature. You go out, you're concentrating, you're watching, you're meditating, you're observing. All that is really, really good for us. And I think it also does this other thing, it's conservation ethic, right? You're feeling more connected to the larger landscape. You care about what's happening in a larger sense. When you go for a walk in the woods, you're going to recognize more plants because you're actually working with them in your garden. And I think just having that compassion, happiness, there's all these studies that show like having gratitude and compassion just makes you a happier person. So I really think these gardens, if you approach them in that way, they're just really good for you. You're always going out there to see what's going on. You might not always be gardening, but I go out there just to see what's happening, like who's showing up in my garden. It's a lot of fun. You can't think about anything else because you're just doing this passive observation, active observation, not passive, you're actively observing. So your attention is going somewhere. It's very soothing. And then I think for children, it's just so essential for them to understand that they're part of the living world and that these creatures are right here alongside us and deserve a place, right? They also deserve to be here. And so I think children really need that connection to nature. And so here's my daughter finding a monarch egg. She found this moth coming out of the ground. It's a Nessus sphinx moth. They eat a lot of times Virginia creeper. I found mine on prairie sundrops, those little yellow flowers earlier. And then here she is, she like picked up a skipper butterfly out of the aromatic aster. So, it's just, again, as a child, like, she just has that level of connection to the world around her. So I have these lists. I know we're getting low on time here. So I can probably put these together. These are all kind of tried and true, great garden plants for our gardens. I know they do well. I know which ones have more of an aggressive tendency. I try not to put those on here. But some of them that do spread a little too much, you just pick them up and you share them, or you make a new garden. But there really is just so much. So, and I really think, to really know these plants, you just start using them. Just get some prairie catalogs and, start looking at like Prairie Moon Nursery or Prairie Nursery and looking at their sites. They're very, very helpful. I know for me, like most of our education always comes from the garden centers. And for me, it was from some books, from the natural landscapes too. Another way to get some good inspiration is go visit a prairie. go visit a well-restored woodland. They're all around us. We have people, amazing ecological restorationists who are doing such amazing work to bring these plants back to us, to get rid of the invasive species and bring these plants back. So I find that's very interesting. I've gone out to Wolford Prairie and I'm like, that big blue stem grass looks great with obedient plant, like they're growing right next to each other. So why not try to put that in my garden? You know, I really love how that wild quinine is looking next to that wild blue indigo. Let's try that. I mean, so that's a really great way, I think, to really start to adjust, you know, your aesthetic, what you think looks right in a garden, is by visiting these natural areas and then just being astounded at the life that they support. Really quickly about maintenance. They do need some maintenance. You don't want to just let weeds cover up, and until you get things really established and really densely planted, you can get that. So you want to just make sure that weeds, so a lot of times what I do with weeds is I pull them up, and if they don't have like seed heads on them, I will just compost in place. And a lot of times, even if they do, I just leave them underneath a plant, because they're going to decompose and they're not going to get sun and they're never going to pop up. And it's not, for me, it's not really a big deal if they do. It's just like so manageable. I don't do conventional cleanup, because if you rake everything out, you cut everything down, you're removing the building blocks for your soil. You're removing so many of the animals, these beautiful animals that are trying to survive and are going to do good for you in the spring and the summer. You're getting rid of them. So I don't do conventional cleanup. That's like probably a whole other talk. Any unwanted seedlings, you know, if some things do spread, like cut plant might start to get a little bit too happy, you just simply pull them up or you pot them up and share. You can trim stems mid to late spring, about 12 to 18 inches. That gives cavity nesting native pollinators a nesting site. And I see it all the time in my garden. And I think I have a picture in this section. If leaves settle too thickly, it gets like we get a lot of rain. I do move leaves off the plants. But a lot of times once things dry up, those plants, they just go right through the leaves. I've seen Jack in the Pulpit, like when it first comes up, like kind of like this narrow little cone, just like move through a leaf, like just punctured a leaf, and just, it didn't bother it. It's like, you know, it has no problem moving up. And then if you don't like the look of leaves, some people have a hard time, especially when you're first new with this, and like, I can't stand not heavy mulch. You can put some mulch on it, just a light layer, you know, just maybe hold the leaves down and kind of give it that uniform look. That's fine. But because I know in March, my garden is always like, oh, it's so hard. But after in April, the plants come up, it's green, and you don't even see the ground anymore. So nobody's gonna know. And then I know my fireflies are there, my lacewings are there, my bees are there, my butterflies are there, moths are there, like all of those important components of the food web are there. And I know the spring migrating birds will be coming through. I know I'll have food for my birds that are residents for the summer, and then the birds that are coming through for the fall. So things are standing, so everybody's got some food for the fall and the winter as well. And there is a little yellow-faced bee hanging out in an aster stem. So super cute. These yellow-faced bees, they're related to the native bees in Hawaii, and all 7 species, it's their only real native bee. All 7 of these are now on the endangered list. So we're kind of lucky to have these. So where to get some of these plants? You want to make sure that you get ethical sources online. Really great place is Prairie Moon Nursery. I get a lot of seeds. They have lots of help, resources, education to help you learn how to grow these things from seed. Prairie Nursery has really nice plants too. They usually do their shipping in the spring and the fall because of the heat, but you can get seeds year round. And Possibility Place, which is down in Moni, Illinois, I think they're now doing some shipping. So they're a great place, family run. All of their plants are what we call local ecotype. They've gotten the seed sources from plants within, I think, 150 miles. They're also the experts on woody plants like shrubs and native trees. So they're really, really important. So they're a great place. We have lots of native plant sales. They're usually only in the spring. And then locally, I know Empowering Gardens has been carrying a lot of native Seguin Gardens, the Growing Place out in Naperville, and then Good Earth too. And they also will special order, I think, plants for you from Midwest Ground Covers and their Natural Garden Native line. And this is my Parkway garden with all my plants in there. And let's see what else. Yep, and you can always join our wildlife quarter. So if you start planting native plants and you want to be part of a growing movement, you can certainly do that to help defeat this depauperate landscape, right? And there's nothing there for the other animals. And this has really grown here. So this is just our map with the little pins of different of our gardens people have joined over the years. And here is a list of books. And so I'll probably put those up in a document. Maybe they can share those with you later. But I think all of these are really, really great books. They will help you with like design. They'll give you some ideas. But I think there's nothing that can replace experience or seeing the plants kind of in the flesh, so to speak. So go out into natural areas, you know, walk by gardens, get some of those catalogs, because those are really great education resources, I think. Because I know it's hard to gain this knowledge from just going to the garden center.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's
Amazing. Amazing.
cool.
I'm
sorry I went a little bit longer, but
yeah, I mentioned if people can stick on, you know, we would go a little bit over. Lurie
okay.
Garden was really my first inspiration in this area. I studied that plant list from the Lurie Garden to really understand what is possible for planting here. And I then got a book, and I would walk into some of these greenhouses and garden centers with my book, and they would be like, oh no, here comes the lady with the book. What are we going to do with her? And that was really, you know, a great way for me to get started, was just testing and trying things out. And like Stephanie, I have converted my entire parkway along Division. For those of you that live in Northeast Oak Park, the whole parkway is converted and there's no grass. And so, you know, I'm learning as I go. There's lots of mistakes, but I've been dividing and sharing with people, and just trying to sponge up information and knowledge from so many good resources like what Stephanie and Wild Ones provides. I will mention that I am personally working with Wild Ones to bring a native garden virtual tour to the community this year. Unfortunately, because of our current circumstances, we weren't able to do a live tour, but we will have really in-depth behind the scenes experiences for you to view and ask questions, much like today's presentation, but we'll be featuring 3 local gardens, and that will be in September, and I'm sure Wild Ones will be putting out information about that. Let me just check and see if there's any other specific questions.
I just want to mention first, also the park district, our Oak Park Park District is doing a lot of stuff with native plants. So you can always go to any of the parks. I've been amazed at like what our park district is doing. And even the Oak Park Conservatory has like a little bioswale with all kinds of native grasses. They had Queen of the Prairie planted outside. So, you know, it is like, it's getting to be more common than it used to be. So you can always go and visit your park, you know, the parks, because they're doing a lot with native plants as well.
Yeah. I think Carroll Center was just planted this year, and somebody, Barb Hunt, thank you for mentioning, Lindbergh was one of the very first parks just north of Division and south of North Avenue by Harlem. It's just exquisite if you want to just walk through a prairie. It's really a lovely specimen, and perhaps one day the friends can actually have a guided tour of it if we can do that. I've got a couple of people that might be able to advise on what plants are there and walk us through it.
And there's that one that Ginger Vanderveer did a lot too, that's next to Holmes. It's up on Chicago Avenue.
Yeah,
so Ginger Vanderveer is one of our co-founders, and so she, before we even got going, she was always out trying to like spread native plants, and she got that section going that runs. It's on Chicago Avenue by the elementary school. Isn't it Holmes?
Yes.
There?
Yes. Holmes.
That's another place to go and watch some plants too.
Yeah. So we can't thank you enough for being interested in this program and being interested in natives and being a supporter of the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory and our beloved 90-year-old conservatory. We're just, you know, thrilled to be able to bring this to you in the comfort of your own home. And Stephanie, thank you for a fantastic presentation. Please support the Friends. Please support Wild Ones. Especially now, we need to keep, you know, people with hands in their dirt and really thinking about what more we can do to benefit our ecosystem. So I'm delighted you could all join us, and farewell.